My name is Detective Marcus Thibodeau, New Orleans Police Department, Homicide Division, badge number 1847. I served the city of New Orleans for 27 years before I walked away from everything I'd ever known, unable to carry the weight of what I'd witnessed any longer. They say every cop has that one case that breaks them, that haunts their dreams and makes them question everything they thought they knew about good and evil, about reality itself. For me, that case started on a humid August night in 1996, in a city where the dead have never truly rested, and where some murders can't be solved because they weren't committed by anyone human. Before I tell you what happened in the French Quarter that night, before I share the truth about the 17 bodies we found in that townhouse on Dauphine Street, I need you to understand that if you're watching this alone, especially if you're in New Orleans right now, you might want to turn on another light. And hey, if this story keeps you up tonight, if it makes you think twice about those shadows in the corner of your room, consider hitting that subscribe button so you don't miss the other cases I'm finally ready to talk about. Drop a like if you've ever felt that chill down your spine walking through the French Quarter at night. Trust me, that feeling isn't just your imagination. New Orleans isn't like other cities. It never has been. Built on swampland, below sea level, it's a place that shouldn't exist, but does anyway. Defying nature through pure, stubborn will, and a complex system of pumps that work day and night to keep the water at bay. The dead here don't stay buried. They float back up, which is why our cemeteries are cities of the dead above ground, marble and concrete tombs that look like tiny houses for spirits that refuse to leave. Every local knows the city has a darkness to it that goes beyond crime statistics and murder rates. It's in the air, thick and oppressive like the humidity that makes you feel like you're drowning just walking down the street. I grew up in the 9th Ward, raised by my grand-mère who filled my head with stories of Loa and spirits, of Marie Laveau and the old ways that never really died when the modern world arrived. I joined the NOPD, partly to escape those stories, to prove that everything could be explained by evidence and logic, that the shadows that seemed to move on their own were just tricks of light and exhausted minds. For 15 years, I was successful in that denial. I solved cases through detective work, through fingerprints and witness statements and good old-fashioned shoe leather investigation. The weird stuff, the things that didn't quite add up, I learned to file away in the back of my mind, focusing on what could be proven in court. But the Dauphine Street case changed everything. It started with what should have been a routine welfare check. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on August 13, 1996. A neighbor complained about a smell coming from the townhouse at 1428 Dauphine Street, a 3-story Creole building that had been converted into apartments back in the 1970s. The responding officers broke down the door after getting no response and immediately called for backup and homicide detectives. I was on call that night, finishing up paperwork from another case when my pager went off. My partner, Detective Ray Mouton, picked me up 20 minutes later, and we drove through the French Quarter streets still buzzing with tourists despite the late hour. The smell hit us before we even got out of the car. It was sweet and cloying, the unmistakable scent of death mixed with something else, something that made my stomach turn in a way that 20 years of crime scenes hadn't prepared me for. It smelled like copper and incense, like burnt herbs and rotting flowers. The uniformed officers standing outside looked pale, and one young cop was bent over in the gutter, losing what was probably his dinner. That should have been my first warning. These weren't rookies. They were seasoned officers who had seen their share of violence in a city that averaged a murder a day. Officer Patricia Williams, a 10-year veteran I'd worked with before, met us at the door. Her usually steady hands were shaking slightly as she handed us latex gloves and paper booties for our shoes. "It's bad, Marcus," she said quietly, using my first name instead of my rank, which told me just how rattled she was. "I've never seen anything like this. We've got 17 bodies, all in the parlor, and Marcus, they're arranged. The word arranged sent a chill down my spine. In my experience, killers who arranged their victims were the worst kind. The ones who saw murder as art, who took pleasure not just in the killing, but in the display. Serial killers, cult leaders, the kind of people whose minds operated on a completely different frequency from the rest of humanity. I glanced at Ray, who was already pulling on his gloves, his face set in the grim expression I'd seen too many times before. We'd been partners for 7 years, had worked dozens of homicides together. But something about this felt different from the moment we stepped through that door. The townhouse's entrance opened into a narrow hallway that led to a formal parlor, the kind of room that wealthy Creoles would have used to receive guests a century ago. The walls were covered in faded silk wallpaper, peeling in places to reveal the horsehair plaster beneath. The air inside was thick, almost solid with that horrible smell, and underneath it was something else, the sound of flies, thousands of them, creating a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I'd been to murder scenes where bodies had been left for days, weeks even, but I'd never heard anything like that sound. It was almost musical, rising and falling in waves like some hellish symphony. We followed Patricia down the hallway, our footsteps muffled by a runner carpet that might have once been red but was now brown with age and God knows what else. The closer we got to the parlor, the stronger the smell became, and the louder that humming grew. I could feel sweat running down my back despite the air conditioning unit that was running somewhere in the building. Ray was muttering under his breath, and I caught the words of a prayer his Catholic mother had probably taught him decades ago. I'm not a religious man, hadn't been to Mass since my confirmation, but in that moment, I wished I had my Grand-Mère's rosary in my pocket. Patricia stopped at the doorway to the parlor and stepped aside. "Forensics is on the way," she said, "but we haven't touched anything. We've been waiting for you." She paused, then added in a whisper, "Be careful, Marcus. There's something wrong here, something more than just murder." I wanted to tell her she was being dramatic, that murder was murder and dead was dead, but the words died in my throat when I looked into that room. The 17 bodies were indeed arranged, but not in any pattern I'd ever seen or studied. They were positioned in a perfect spiral, starting from the walls and circling inward to a center point where a massive silver bowl sat on a pedestal. Each body was seated in a cross-legged position, hands placed precisely on their knees, heads tilted back at the exact same angle. They were all dressed in white robes that looked handmade, and around each of their necks was a necklace of what appeared to be bones, small ones, like from birds or rodents. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was their faces. Each victim's mouth was open in what might have been a scream, or might have been singing, and their eyes were gone. Not gouged out or cut away, but gone, leaving smooth skin where the eye sockets should have been, as if they had never had eyes at all. The flies I'd been hearing were crawling in and out of their open mouths, creating that horrible, humming sound as their wings beat in the confined space. And in the center of it all, in that silver bowl, was a dark liquid that reflected the overhead light like oil, but moved with a life of its own, rippling without any air current to disturb it. Ray made a choking sound beside me and stumbled backward into the hallway. I heard him retching, but I couldn't move. I stood frozen in that doorway, my mind trying to process what I was seeing while every instinct I had screamed at me to run. The bodies showed no signs of decomposition despite the smell, no bloating or discoloration. If it weren't for their missing eyes and the flies, they might have been meditating, frozen in some eternal moment of transcendence or horror. I forced myself to look closer, to do my job, and that's when I noticed the symbols. They were carved into the wooden floor around each body, intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. Some seemed familiar, like veuve I'd seen chalked on sidewalks during Vodou ceremonies, but others were completely alien, geometric designs that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. The lines of the carvings were filled with something dark, blood, I assumed at first, but as I looked closer, I realized it was moving, flowing through the carved channels like it was being pumped through invisible veins. "Detective Thibodeau?" A voice behind me made me jump. I turned to find a young crime scene technician, his face already pale from the smell. "We're ready to begin processing the scene, but—" He trailed off, looking past me into the room. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, and then louder. "What the hell is this?" I didn't have an answer for him. In 20 years of police work, I'd seen ritualistic murders. I'd seen serial killers' handiwork. I'd seen the aftermath of gang executions and domestic violence that went too far. I glanced at Ray, who was already pulling on his gloves, his face set in the grim expression I'd seen too many times before. We'd been partners for 7 years, had worked dozens of homicides together. But something about this felt different from the moment we stepped through that door. The townhouse's entrance opened into a narrow hallway that led to a formal parlor, the kind of room that wealthy Creoles would have used to receive guests a century ago. The walls were covered in faded silk wallpaper, peeling in places to reveal the horsehair plaster beneath. The air inside was thick, almost solid with that horrible smell, and underneath it was something else. The sound of flies, thousands of them, creating a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I'd been to murder scenes where bodies had been left for days, weeks even, but I'd never heard anything like that sound. It was almost musical, rising and falling in waves like some hellish symphony. We followed Patricia down the hallway, our footsteps muffled by a runner carpet that might have once been red but was now brown with age and God knows what else. The closer we got to the parlor, the stronger the smell became, and the louder that humming grew. I could feel sweat running down my back despite the air conditioning unit that was running somewhere in the building. Ray was muttering under his breath, and I caught the words of a prayer his Catholic mother had probably taught him decades ago. I'm not a religious man, hadn't been to Mass since my confirmation, but in that moment, I wished I had my Grand-Mère's rosary in my pocket. Patricia stopped at the doorway to the parlor and stepped aside. "Forensics is on the way," she said, "but we haven't touched anything. We've been waiting for you." She paused, then added in a whisper, "Be careful, Marcus. There's something wrong here, something more than just murder." I wanted to tell her she was being dramatic, that murder was murder and dead was dead, but the words died in my throat when I looked into that room. The 17 bodies were indeed arranged, but not in any pattern I'd ever seen or studied. They were positioned in a perfect spiral, starting from the walls and circling inward to a center point where a massive silver bowl sat on a pedestal. Each body was seated in a cross-legged position, hands placed precisely on their knees, heads tilted back at the exact same angle. They were all dressed in white robes that looked handmade, and around each of their necks was a necklace of what appeared to be bones, small ones, like from birds or rodents. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was their faces. Each victim's mouth was open in what might have been a scream, or might have been singing, and their eyes were gone. Not gouged out or cut away, but gone, leaving smooth skin where the eye sockets should have been, as if they had never had eyes at all. The flies I'd been hearing were crawling in and out of their open mouths, creating that horrible humming sound as their wings beat in the confined space. And in the center of it all, in that silver bowl, was a dark liquid that reflected the overhead light like oil, but moved with a life of its own, rippling without any air current to disturb it. Ray made a choking sound beside me and stumbled backward into the hallway. I heard him retching, but I couldn't move. I stood frozen in that doorway, my mind trying to process what I was seeing while every instinct I had screamed at me to run. The bodies showed no signs of decomposition despite the smell, no bloating or discoloration. If it weren't for their missing eyes and the flies, they might have been meditating, frozen in some eternal moment of transcendence or horror. I forced myself to look closer, to do my job, and that's when I noticed the symbols. They were carved into the wooden floor around each body, intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. Some seemed familiar, like veuve I'd seen chalked on sidewalks during voodoo ceremonies, but others were completely alien, geometric designs that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. The lines of the carvings were filled with something dark, blood, I assumed at first, but as I looked closer, I realized it was moving, flowing through the carved channels like it was being pumped through invisible veins. "Detective Thibodeau?" A voice behind me made me jump. I turned to find a young crime scene technician, his face already pale from the smell. "We're ready to begin processing the scene, but..." He trailed off, looking past me into the room. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, and then louder. "What the hell is this?" I didn't have an answer for him. In 20 years of police work, I'd seen ritualistic murders. I'd seen serial killers' handiwork. I'd seen the aftermath of gang executions and domestic violence that went too far. When the Marine Patrol brought him in, he was perfectly preserved inside his crystalline shell, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. But the strangest thing was that he was still warm to the touch. And if you put your ear close to the crystal, you could hear something that sounded like screaming, very faint and very far away. The investigation officially stalled there. We had our killer, technically, but no explanation for how the murders had been committed that would stand up in court or even in a rational conversation. The brass wanted the case closed quietly, the bodies released for burial, the whole thing forgotten. They classified it as a murder-suicide with unusual circumstances and sealed the more disturbing evidence. But I couldn't let it go. I started researching on my own time, diving into the historical archives at the presbytery, talking to old practitioners in the Vodou community, even reaching out to professors of anthropology and religious studies at universities across the country. What I found was a pattern of similar incidents stretching back centuries, always in cities built on water, always involving 17 victims, always occurring 33 years apart. Venice in 1534, Amsterdam in 1666 St., Petersburg in 1798, and now New Orleans in 1996. Each incident was followed by a period of unusual prosperity for the city in question, as if the sacrifice had purchased something. But there were also reports of increased supernatural activity, of people disappearing without explanation, of shadows that moved wrong, and water that sometimes reflected faces that weren't there. The cities that had undergone this ritual were changed, marked in some fundamental way that attracted both good fortune and inexplicable horror in equal measure. I tracked down a professor at Miskatonic University in Massachusetts, Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, who had made a career studying what she called urban occultism. She flew down to New Orleans to examine the evidence I'd collected, and what she told me changed my understanding of everything. "Detective Thibodeau," she said over coffee at Café du Monde, the sounds of the French Quarter barely audible over the rain that had started falling. "What you've stumbled upon is something far older and more dangerous than you realize. There are things that existed before humanity, beings that ruled this earth when it was young. Most of them are gone now, sleeping in places we can't reach or existing in dimensions parallel to our own. But in certain locations, where the conditions are right, where water and land meet in specific ways, the boundaries are thin." She pulled out a map of New Orleans, overlaid with geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Your city sits at one of these confluence points. The Mississippi River, Lake Pontchartrain, the Gulf of Mexico, they create a unique geographic and mystical arrangement. The original inhabitants knew this, which is why they avoided building permanent settlements here. But when the French came, when they built New Orleans despite all logic and reason, they inadvertently created a beacon, a lighthouse calling out to things that should remain hidden. The ritual, she continued, is not a sacrifice to appease these beings. It's a reinforcement of the boundary, a way to keep them from breaking through entirely. The 17 victims become guardians, their transformed bodies creating a mystical barrier that holds for 33 years. Without it, she trailed off, staring out at the rain-soaked streets. Without it what? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. Without it, the city that was before New Orleans, the place those things built when the world was young, would rise from beneath the water and overlap with your current reality. The results would be catastrophic not just for New Orleans, but for the entire world. These rituals, horrible as they are the only thing maintaining the separation between our world and theirs. I wanted to dismiss her as insane, but I'd seen the bodies, I'd read the evidence, I'd felt the wrongness in that townhouse on Dauphine Street. And worse, if she was right, if the ritual really did protect the city, then in 33 years, in 2029, it would need to happen again. 17 more people would die, transformed into crystalline guardians to hold back something unimaginable. After Dr. Blackwood left New Orleans, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd told me. The idea that our city, our entire reality, was balanced on the edge of a knife, held in place by a ritual of murder and transformation, was too much to process. But the evidence was undeniable, and worse, I was starting to notice things I'd previously dismissed or ignored. The city was full of signs if you knew how to look for them. There were the street performers in Jackson Square who sometimes paused mid-performance, their eyes going vacant as they stared at something no one else could see. There were the patterns in the wrought iron balconies of the French Quarter that, when viewed from certain angles, formed symbols that matched those from the crime scene. There were the old women who sat on stoops in Treme, muttering prayers in Creole that weren't quite Catholic, weren't quite Vodou, but something older that made passers-by unconsciously cross to the other side of the street. I started keeping a private journal, documenting everything strange I encountered. Ray thought I was losing it, becoming obsessed with a closed case, but he didn't know what I knew. He hadn't read the rest of Lucien Beauregard's journal, the parts that described what he'd seen in his dreams, the city beneath the water where massive things with too many eyes and geometries that shouldn't exist held court in palaces of living shadow. In October 1996, 2 months after the Dauphine Street murders, I had my first direct encounter with whatever lurked beneath New Orleans. I was working a late shift, driving through the Bywater district following up on a completely unrelated robbery when my radio started acting up. Static filled the channel, but underneath it, I could hear music. Jazz, but not like any jazz I'd ever heard. The instruments sounded wrong, as if they were made from materials that didn't exist in our world, and the rhythm made my heart skip beats trying to match it. I pulled over, intending to call for a radio check, when I noticed the water. New Orleans floods regularly. Even a moderate rain can overwhelm our pumping stations. But this was different. The water rising from the storm drains wasn't just water. It was black, viscous like oil, but moving with purpose, creeping up the sides of buildings, forming patterns and symbols on the walls before receding. And in its reflection, I saw not the streetlights and buildings of the Bywater, but towering spires of some alien architecture. Structures that curved in impossible ways, bridges that spanned distances that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. I got out of my patrol car, drawn by something I couldn't name. The black water pooled around my feet, and immediately I felt it. A consciousness, vast and alien, pressing against my mind. Images flooded my thoughts. New Orleans as it was before humans arrived, when things that were not quite animals and not quite plants ruled from temples of living bone. I saw the first humans to encounter these beings, saw the bargains that were struck, the prices that were paid. I saw the French settlers unknowingly building their city on the bones of something ancient and terrible, their very presence awakening things that should have remained sleeping. Then I saw the future, or possible futures. New Orleans underwater, not from a hurricane but from something rising from beneath. Buildings twisted into new shapes by non-Euclidean physics. People transformed into things that served purposes human minds couldn't comprehend. And through it all, the sound of that impossible jazz played on instruments of crystallized human souls. The vision broke when Ray's hand grabbed my shoulder, pulling me back from the edge of the black water. I hadn't heard him arrive, but apparently I'd been standing there for over an hour, completely unresponsive to radio calls. The water was already receding, leaving behind only the usual New Orleans street flooding, but I could still feel the echo of that vast consciousness in my mind. "Marcus, what the hell?" Ray's face was a mix of concern and fear. "You've been standing here like a statue. Dispatch has been trying to reach you." I couldn't explain what I'd seen, not in any way that wouldn't result in a psychological evaluation and probable suspension. So I blamed it on exhaustion, on stress from the Dauphine Street case. Ray didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes, but he let it go. That's what partners do. They cover for each other, even when they don't understand what they're covering for. But the encounters didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. I would see figures in my peripheral vision, tall things that moved with too many joints, that disappeared when I looked directly at them. I would hear whispers in languages that predated human speech, offering bargains I didn't understand for prices I couldn't comprehend. And the dreams were the worst. Every night I found myself in that other New Orleans, the city beneath the water. I walked streets that were familiar but wrong, where the laws of physics were more like suggestions. I saw the 17 victims from Dauphine Street, their crystallized hearts glowing in their chests, standing guard at points throughout the city. They couldn't speak, but their eyeless faces turned to follow me as I passed, and I could feel their awareness, their eternal vigilance against something pressing in from outside. In one particularly vivid dream, I found myself in what I somehow knew was the original temple, the first structure built by the things that ruled before humans. It was simultaneously underwater and dry, existing in multiple states at once. At its center was a pool of that black water, and rising from it was something I can't properly describe. It had a shape, but that shape changed depending on how I looked at it. It had eyes, thousands of them, but they weren't arranged in any pattern that made sense. It spoke, but not in words, in pure concept and emotion that bypassed language entirely. It showed me the truth about the 17. They weren't victims, not exactly. They had been chosen, yes, but not randomly. Each of them carried a specific genetic marker, a trace of DNA that connected them to the original inhabitants of this land, the humans who had first encountered the things from beneath and made the original bargain. Every 33 years, 17 of their descendants were required to undergo the transformation, to become living anchors that kept the two realities from merging. The being showed me Lucien Beauregard's family history, how his ancestors had been the keepers of this knowledge, the ones who ensured the ritual was performed when necessary. It was a burden passed down through generations, driving many of them to madness, but necessary for the survival of the city and perhaps the world. Lucien had tried to break the cycle, had attempted to leave New Orleans and let someone else handle the responsibility, but the calling was in his blood, literally encoded in his DNA. When I woke from that dream, I found symbols drawn in condensation on my bedroom window, the same symbols from the crime scene. They faded as the sun rose, but I knew they'd been real. I was being marked, being shown these things for a reason. The question was whether I was being warned or recruited. I threw myself into research, using every resource available to me as a detective, and many that weren't strictly legal. I broke into sealed records, bribed clerks for access to archives that were supposed to be restricted, even consulted with practitioners of the darker arts who operated in the shadows of New Orleans' tourist-friendly voodoo shops. What I found was a conspiracy of silence stretching back centuries. There was a secret society, unnamed and unofficial, that had formed around the knowledge of what lurked beneath New Orleans. Its members included people from all walks of life: politicians, police officers, priests, professors, even street performers and tour guides. They were the Watchers, the ones who monitored the boundaries between worlds and ensured that when the time came, the ritual would be performed. They had been watching the 17 victims for years, identifying them through dreams and signs, preparing for what needed to be done. I found evidence that the police department itself was infiltrated by this society. Certain cases were deliberately buried. Certain areas were unofficially off limits for patrol, and certain phenomena were never officially reported. The commissioner himself was part of it, as were several judges and members of the city council. They all knew the truth about New Orleans, about the price that had to be paid to keep it from sliding into something far worse than destruction. In December 1996, I was approached by one of them. I was sitting in Mother's, a po' boy shop on Poydras Street, when an elderly black woman sat down across from me. She was dressed simply but elegantly, and something about her presence made the busy restaurant seem to fade into background noise. "Detective Thibodeau," she said, her voice carrying a weight of authority that had nothing to do with volume. "You've been looking into things that are better left undisturbed." "Who are you?" I asked, though somehow I already knew she was connected to everything I'd been investigating. "My name is Marie Arsenault, and I'm what you might call a guardian of the balance. My family has been watching over New Orleans since before it was called New Orleans, since before the French, before the Spanish, back when the indigenous peoples knew enough to build their homes on stilts and never drink from certain springs." She leaned forward, and I could see that her eyes were not quite right. They were too old for her face, too knowing, as if they'd seen centuries pass. "You've been chosen, detective. Not for the transformation. That cup has passed you by. But to be a witness, a recorder. Someone who knows the truth and can ensure it's not forgotten when the next cycle comes." "The next cycle isn't for 33 years, I said. She smiled, but it was sad. "Time isn't as linear as you think, especially here where the boundaries are thin. The next cycle is in 33 years, yes, but the preparation begins now. The 17 who will be called in 2029 are already being born, their fates written in their DNA. Some of them will try to run, as people always do. Some will embrace it, understanding the necessity, but all 17 must be ready when the time comes, or the consequences will be catastrophic." She stood to leave, then paused. "You have a choice, detective. You can forget what you've learned, request a transfer, leave New Orleans and never look back. Or you can accept your role as a witness, a guardian of truth. But know that once you choose, there's no going back. The knowledge will change you, mark you, make you something other than entirely human." After she left, I sat in that po' boy shop for hours, watching the normal people living their normal lives, blissfully unaware of what lurked beneath their city. I thought about my grandmère's stories, about the 17 victims whose crystallized hearts now served as mystical anchors, about Lucien Beauregard trapped in his amber prison, still screaming where no one could hear him. I thought about the black water and the consciousness that had touched my mind, showing me truths that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. I made my choice that night in Mother's. I couldn't walk away from the truth, couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. Maybe it was the detective in me, unable to leave a mystery unsolved. Maybe it was my grandmère's blood, carrying some genetic memory of the old ways and old obligations. Or maybe the city itself had chosen me, the way it chooses all its guardians, through a combination of coincidence and fate that's impossible to untangle. The changes started slowly. At first it was just an enhanced awareness, the ability to see the signs that had always been there. I could spot the members of the secret society by the way they moved through the French Quarter, always walking certain patterns, avoiding specific corners where the boundaries were thinnest. I could hear the wrongness in the jazz music that drifted from certain clubs after midnight, the notes that shouldn't exist but did. I could feel the pulse of the city like a living thing, its heartbeat synchronized with something vast and sleeping beneath Lake Pontchartrain. Ray noticed the changes in me. We'd been partners for 7 years, and you can't hide that kind of transformation from someone who knows you that well. He confronted me one rainy night in February 1997 as we sat in our patrol car watching the fog roll in from the river. "You're different, Marcus," he said without preamble. "Ever since the Dauphine Street case. You see things, know things. Sometimes you react to stuff before it happens, and your eyes—" He trailed off, unable to articulate what he saw there. I wanted to lie to him, to protect him from the truth, but Ray deserved better than that. So I told him everything. The ritual, the beings beneath the water, the secret society that had protected New Orleans for centuries. I showed him my private journal, the photographs I'd taken of symbols that appeared and disappeared throughout the city, the documentation of impossible things that happened when no one was looking. To his credit, Ray didn't immediately demand I seek psychiatric help. He listened, asked questions, and then was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "Show me. If this is real, show me something that proves it." So I did. I took him to a place I'd discovered in my research, an old cemetery in Algiers that wasn't on any official maps. The tombs there were older than New Orleans itself, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. And at the center of the cemetery was a pool of that black water, perfectly still despite the rain that was falling. "Look into it," I told him, "but don't touch it. And whatever you see, don't let it pull you in." Ray approached the pool cautiously, and I saw the moment when he saw it. The city beneath, the impossible architecture, the things that moved in ways that violated every law of physics. He stumbled backward, his face pale, his hands shaking. He didn't speak for the entire drive back to the station, and when our shift ended, he requested a transfer to a different district. We never partnered again, though sometimes I'd catch him watching me from across a crime scene, that mixture of fear and pity in his eyes. Without Ray, I was increasingly isolated in the department, but that suited my new role. Marie Arsenault became my mentor of sorts, teaching me to navigate the hidden currents of New Orleans' secret history. She showed me the safe houses where the society met, introduced me to others who carried the burden of knowledge. There was Father Miguel, a Catholic priest who performed exorcisms that the church would never sanction. There was Dr. Charlotte Tran, an emergency room doctor who knew how to treat injuries that didn't have medical explanations. There was Jackson Blue, a street musician whose saxophone could play notes that kept certain things at bay. Through them, I learned that New Orleans wasn't unique. Every city built on water had similar guardians, similar obligations. Venice had its Council of Ten, who ensured the city's foundations remained stable despite what swam in the canals beneath. Amsterdam had its watchers who maintained the dikes against more than just the sea. But New Orleans was special because it was newer, its boundaries less established, its bargains still being negotiated. In 1998, Hurricane George threatened the city, and I learned that natural disasters were often more than they seemed. The storm wasn't just meteorological, it was a test of the boundaries, a probing of our defenses by things that existed in the spaces between air and water. The society mobilized, performing rituals at key points throughout the city, strengthening the anchors that the 17 had become. I participated in one of these rituals, and what I experienced there changed me further. We gathered in the basement of an abandoned church in the 9th Ward, 13 of us forming a circle around a map of New Orleans drawn in salt and ash. Marie led the ceremony, speaking words in a language that predated human civilization, and as she spoke, I could feel the 17 victims from Dauphine Street responding. Their crystallized hearts began to resonate, creating a frequency that reinforced the boundary between worlds. But maintaining that frequency required energy, and that energy had to come from somewhere. It came from us. I felt years of my life being pulled away, not taken, but given freely, fed into the barrier that kept our reality intact. When the ritual ended, I looked in a mirror and saw new gray in my hair, new lines around my eyes. I had aged 5 years in a single night, and I understood then the true cost of keeping New Orleans safe. The society's members didn't just guard knowledge. They paid for the city's continued existence with pieces of their own lives. Hurricane George's passed without major damage, the storm weakening at the last moment in a way meteorologists couldn't explain. But those of us who knew the truth understood that it hadn't weakened naturally. It had been turned aside by the barrier we'd reinforced, by the lives we'd voluntarily sacrificed to keep the boundaries intact. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of cases both mundane and supernatural. I worked regular homicides during the day and investigated stranger deaths at night. There was the artist in the Marini who painted portraits that aged instead of their subjects. There was the chef in the garden district whose gumbo contained ingredients that didn't exist in any cookbook and whose customers sometimes disappeared mid-meal, leaving only their clothes behind. There was the tour guide whose ghost tours occasionally included actual ghosts, traumatizing tourists who'd expected theatrical scares, not genuine encounters with the dead. Each case taught me more about the true nature of New Orleans, about the constant negotiation between our world and what lay beneath. I learned that the city's famous above-ground cemeteries weren't just because of the water table. They were barrier points, places where the dead could be properly contained, so they didn't slip into the spaces between worlds. I learned that Mardi Gras wasn't just a celebration, but a massive ritual of chaos and release that helped stabilize the city's supernatural pressures for the rest of the year. I learned that the Mississippi River itself was partially sentient, carrying memories of every civilization that had ever touched its banks, and that it sometimes demanded its own tribute separate from what the things beneath required. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit, and everything changed. The storm was more than a natural disaster. It was a fundamental breach of the boundaries we'd worked so hard to maintain. The levees didn't just fail physically, they failed metaphysically, allowing things to pour into our reality that should never have been able to manifest. For 3 days, New Orleans existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and those of us who could see the truth witnessed horrors that the rest of the world explained away as trauma-induced hallucinations. I saw creatures made of water and wind stalking through the flooded streets, harvesting something from the bodies of the drowned. I saw buildings phase in and out of existence, sometimes showing their current ruined state, sometimes showing what they'd been, sometimes showing what they were in that other New Orleans beneath the water. I saw the 17 anchors straining against forces they were never meant to withstand alone, their crystallized hearts cracking under the pressure. The society did what it could, but we were overwhelmed. Marie Arsenault died holding a boundary point in the lower Ninth Ward, her body simply dissolving into light as she poured everything she had into maintaining the barrier. Father Miguel went mad, his mind shattered by direct contact with something from beyond. Dr. Tran disappeared entirely, pulled into one of the dimensional rifts that had opened throughout the city. When the waters finally receded, New Orleans was fundamentally changed. The boundaries were weaker, more porous. Things that had been content to remain hidden now walked openly, though most people's minds refused to process what they were seeing. The murder rate skyrocketed, but many of those deaths weren't murders in any conventional sense. They were collections, payments on debts that had accumulated during the chaos, or simply predation by things that no longer needed to hide. I tried to continue my work, but the NOPD was gutted by the storm, and the city's priorities had shifted to basic survival. The secret society was scattered, its knowledge fragmented, its power broken. New guardians emerged, younger and less trained, trying to maintain boundaries they didn't fully understand. Mistakes were made. More people disappeared. The wrong rituals were performed in the wrong places, sometimes making things worse instead of better. By 2010, I couldn't take it anymore. The weight of knowledge, the constant vigilance, the pieces of my life I'd sacrificed to keep the city stable, it was too much. I retired from the force, though you never really retire from the kind of knowledge I carried. I moved to a small house in Metairie, just outside New Orleans proper, but close enough to monitor what was happening. I wrote everything down, all of it, creating a record that future guardians could use. I documented every ritual, every boundary point, every sign and symbol that indicated the barriers were weakening. I interviewed the surviving members of the old society, recording their knowledge before it was lost forever. I became a keeper of secrets that nobody wanted to know, but somebody had to preserve. And I waited, because 2029 was approaching, the 33-year cycle coming round again. The 17 new anchors were out there somewhere, living their lives, unaware that they carried the genetic markers that would call them to sacrifice. Some were probably children now, others not yet born. But they would be found, would be called, would be transformed. The ritual would be performed, willingly or not, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. In 2023, as I write this final account, I can feel the pressure building. The boundaries are thinner than they've ever been. The black water appears more frequently, pooling in basements and bubbling up from storm drains. The jazz music that shouldn't exist plays louder and more often. People are having the dreams again, visions of the city beneath the water, of the things that wait there with infinite patience. Marie Arsenault's granddaughter found me last month. She has the same two old eyes, the same weight of knowledge in her bearing. She told me they're rebuilding the society, preparing for what's coming. She asked if I would help, if I would share what I know with the new generation of guardians. I agreed, because what else could I do? This is my city, for better or worse, and I've seen what happens when the boundaries fail. So I teach them what I know. These young people who've inherited a burden they didn't ask for. I show them the signs to watch for, the rituals that still work, the places where reality is wearing thin. I tell them about the 17 who died in 1996, whose sacrifice has held for 27 years but won't hold forever. Sometimes they ask me if there's hope. if there's a way to break the cycle, to free New Orleans from this obligation. I tell them the truth. I don't know. Maybe somewhere in all the knowledge that's been accumulated over the centuries, there's a solution, a way to permanently separate our world from what lies beneath. Or maybe this is just the price of building a city where no city should exist, of trying to impose human order on a place that was never meant for human habitation. What I do know is that New Orleans will endure one way or another. It always has. Through fires and floods, plagues and storms, through transformations both physical and metaphysical, the city persists. Because that's what New Orleans does. It survives, even when survival requires sacrifices that other cities wouldn't make, knowledge that other people couldn't bear, and bargains that should never be struck. The tourist brochures call New Orleans the city that care forgot, but they have it backward. New Orleans is the city that can't forget, that carries the weight of every deal made, every life sacrificed, every boundary maintained against things that press in from the dark. It's a city built on bones both literal and metaphorical, sustained by jazz and joy and an underlying current of cosmic horror that most people never notice but that flows beneath everything like the Mississippi itself. My name is Marcus Thibodeau, and I was a detective in New Orleans for 27 years. I solved murders that had human explanations and investigated deaths that didn't. I learned truths that broke my marriage, cost me my partner, aged me before my time, and showed me that reality is far more fragile than most people realize. I became a guardian of boundaries I didn't know existed, a keeper of knowledge that nobody wants, and a witness to the price New Orleans pays for its continued existence. If you're reading this in 2029 or later, and you're one of the 17, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what you'll have to endure, for the transformation that will strip away your humanity and make you an eternal anchor between worlds. But know that your sacrifice, horrible as it is, serves a purpose. You'll be protecting not just New Orleans, but perhaps the entire world from something far worse than death. And if you're reading this and you're not one of the 17, if you're just someone who stumbled onto the truth the way I did, you have a choice to make. You can walk away, pretend you never learned any of this, and live a normal life. Or you can join the Watchers, the Guardians, the ones who pay for the city's survival with pieces of their own souls. Either choice is valid. Either choice has consequences. But whatever you choose, remember this. New Orleans is more than just a city. It's a living negotiation between order and chaos, between our world and others, between what is and what should never be. Every jazz note played in the French Quarter, every bead thrown during Mardi Gras, every prayer whispered in Saint. Louis Cathedral is part of that negotiation. We all serve the city in our own ways, whether we know it or not. The water is rising again. I can see it from my window, black and viscous, creeping up from the storm drains. The music is playing, that impossible jazz that makes reality shimmer and bend. The next cycle is beginning, and the 17 are being called. God help them. God help us all.